Morning, everyone. We're back with Bloody History. We're continuing right from where we left off. I appreciate you guys tuning into yesterday's show. I like that whole story on the Mosler murder. There's way more to it than we've ever been led. Do I believe that Melvin Powers had anything to do with the assassination? No. Fuck no. Do I think that Jack Valenti and Vincent Caltagirone Jr. were involved somehow in the murder? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So Vincent had allegedly been living with Jacques Mosler for a year? Like, how did that come about? Like, Vincent's CIA. So I was thinking about it, and do you really think that there's a billionaire on the planet who the CIA hasn't gone after for funding? Of course. Of course. Yeah, that whole story of the Mosler murder, I'd really like to spend a lot more time on that. I don't even know if there's like documents available or what kind of documents are available. Like anybody who knows me knows I don't like going off of other people's books because they're open to interpretation. Hey, even my book is my book is the king of being open to interpretation, right? But yeah, Vincent Caltagirone Jr., the real Raoul, lived with fucking Jacques Mosler for a year. Wild, huh? Wild. I sensed some gay shit going on. All right, but let's continue from where we left off yesterday with the I'm a Patsy by George Mohrenschildt, Part 4. Lee, on the other hand, commented later excitedly how much he liked the film and that he envied us for having lived for a year close to nature, an ascetic life of complete freedom. You've walked almost 4,000 miles to get away from people, comforts, stupid gadgets, and conventions. It would be my dream also. I envy you. I've never been completely free. Yes, it was a great privilege, I told Lee, but it was tough, believe me. We wore out 22 pairs of shoes and garages each. The subject of our film filled most of our last conversation with Lee. I advised him to try the same. We spent quite a lot of money on our trip, but some American lunatic who pretended that he was a saint had done part in our itinerary by himself. Without spending a cent, people fed and clothed him out of charity. I would never do anything without paying for food and lodging, said Lee. And Marina is not an outdoor woman like your wife. Some newspapermen and writers attribute me the part of Svengali, of a sinister, evil advisor to Lee. Nothing could be farther from the truth. He was a strong and stubborn man, 100% American, who had made a decision early in life, in his childhood, as a matter of fact, that the American way of life means unabridged capitalism, crooked politics, violence, racism, pursuit of luxuries rather than ideals, living up to Joneses, etc. And that conviction motivated his escape to Russia. Nothing could have persuaded him to the contrary. Lee's views on Latin America were determined long before we met. On the basis of our trip, I began to look at things somewhat like Lee always did. Previously, I lived in several Latin American countries where the social injustices were obvious. But then I was looking at life as an eager petroleum geologist, not as a sociologist. This time, our primitive trip put us close to simplest people. We lived with them and understood the problems of the poor. And it was exactly what happened to Lee in Japan, hence his immediate close relationship with Yaiko, who was a sensitive and perceptive woman. Lee told me that the same phenomena of awakening to the fate of the poor occurred to Che Guevara when he carried his assignment as a doctor in Central America. In places we visited ourselves, the desperate plight of the poor could not be denied by anyone with open eyes and a little bit of feelings for a fellow man. Che Guevara understood the situation well, said Lee, although his stay in Central America took place years before your trip. But still, you saw dismal poverty in parts of Mexico and Guatemala, San Salvador, Nicaragua, and Panama, didn't you? Yes, we did, but in Costa Rica we found a somewhat different situation. Why? We knew the answer, but asked Lee anyway, simply because he said that this country has never been occupied and corrupted by us Americans. Right he was. The ignorant high school dropout knew the history of different United States interventions in Latin America. And so Costa Rica is Switzerland of Latin America, with a true democratic government, limited police force, no army or air force. You can talk there freely and meet the president in the barbershop in San Jose. You can also find refuge there if you steal millions in the USA. All these problems are clear and open now, but they were not in 1963. We discussed with Lee the dismal poverty of overcrowded El Salvador, where the wealth of the whole country belongs to 23 families. Latifundistas since the Spanish conquest. It's still true today. And then the tragico-comical history of Nicaragua. Somoza family owns most of Nicaragua, and this regime was imposed by the wife of an American ambassador during the occupation by the Marines. An elderly Nicaraguan geologist told us a story of a handsome and husky telephone lineman who seduced the lonesome wife of the Yankee ambassador. The names were mentioned, but I forgot it. And his subsequent appointment as chief of police, which was equivalent to a dictator for life, his and children's. These discussions with Lee took place 13 years ago. Today, the frequent support of the United States of oligarchs, crooked generals, and ruthless dictators is discussed openly in the Congress, Senate, and in the United Nations. But in 1963, such conversations might have been considered subversive. Now, after Vietnam and Watergate, we all see a little clearer and talk more freely. Lee, how do you understand the Latin American situation so well? I'm from New Orleans. As a kid, I met a lot of refugees. Hang on a second. Let me just point this out real quick. So at this point, the Vietnam War is over and Watergate is over. So we're past 1974 when this manuscript was written. More than 10 years after he knew Lee. Plenty of time for lots of embellishments. He remembers some very specific conversations, too, which I think is kind of ironic 10 or 11 years later. Lee, how do you understand the Latin American situation so well? I'm from New Orleans. As a kid, I met a lot of refugees from all these banana republics. No better source of information. In this way, both Lee and I were nonconformist, even revolutionaries. But my long years of experience in Latin America, followed by my son's death and the ensuing sadness, made me commiserate with the fate of the poor and the starving. A younger man, I was career and money mad, a hustler. But Lee was the same since childhood, which made him such a beautiful and worthwhile person to me. I had been in the social register, played with the jet set, knew innumerable rich people, including the Bouvier family, father and mother, and Jacqueline and Lee when they were young girls. All this foolish activity makes me today disgusted with myself. Now all this opportunist waste of time is meaningless. But Jean, my wife, and Lee had always been on the side of the underprivileged, and she had lived in China and saw newborn babies thrown in the garbage because parents were too poor to feed them. To Lee, commiseration for the dejected came naturally. Poor as his family was in New Orleans, he never really experienced hunger. By his inner nature, he belonged to the socially motivated people. In our last meetings, Lee often expressed his concern about this country, past and present. Its origins, according to him, by the hypocritical pilgrims, through Indian genocide, invasion of the continent by the greedy and hungry European masses who, meeting racist attitudes of the Anglos, became even more racist themselves. Before busing confusion arose in this country, Lee was keenly aware of the racist cancer eating America's healthy tissues. All people are SOBs, he often said, but the strongest and more ferocious always win, physically but not morally. Jean often participated in our discussions. Let me explain her background a little to clarify why she got along so well with Lee. Social attitudes are unpredictable, and do not depend on your parents or your environment. Jean's family in China was well-to-do. Her father built a railroad. She lived a luxurious childhood, but she preferred from early days to give rather than to receive. She remembered the Chinese as humble and kind people, dismally poor who hated to fight and rather insulted each other and stamped their feet. Even in huge families, violence was seldom seen. These subjects were interesting to Lee, who discussed them with my wife. She told him of the formation of the puppet state of Manchukuo, the Japanese invasion, and of the ensuing cruelties of her flight from the Japanese to the United States. Lee compared her experiences of the old militaristic Japan with the present Japanese movement, which he knew so well. And so both of them got along fabulously well, instructing each other on the Far Eastern situation 30 years ago and now. Since Marina never participated in these discussions, we would walk with Jean of this curious couple after their departures from our home. The opposites attract was Jean's opinion. I think it's sex was my opinion, but what type of sex, I don't know. But there must have been a strong emotional bond between those two. They always came to each other, except just before the assassination. Lee begged Marina to come and live with him. He had a job with the book depository. Everything seemed fine. And Marina refused because Lee could not buy a washing machine to which she had access in Mrs. Payne's house. From this incident came the theory attributed to me by some publication, Esquire, I think, a washing machine theory of the Kennedy assassination. Supposedly, I compared Marina to a typical Texas woman who would not go back to her husband because he could not afford a new Cadillac, but in poor Marina's case, it was a washing machine. The comparison is not bad, but I did not enunciate it, since for me, Lee is innocent of Kennedy's assassination. I cannot prove it, but the later events which will be discussed tend to prove Lee's innocence. I did not know Lee to be a dangerous man, a man who would kill like a maniac without any reason, with reason any man is a potential killer, and we proved that he was rather an admirer of Kennedy. Lee's convictions, when we knew him, were fairly liberal, equalitarian, not even communist, but rather socialist. He seemed to have abandoned his early, rather vague Marxist beliefs. He did not try to influence me in any way, nor did I try to exert any influence on him. That's why it's so easy to be with you, said Lee one day. Everyone tries to influence me one way or another, in the Soviet Union and Japan here, and you leave me strictly alone. Our film recurred frequently in our current conversations, and even Marina participated in these discussions. How could you have done such a thing at your age, she asked Jean, and to look so trim, strong, and beautiful? Efforts and constant exercise, control over your body, would lecture Jean, but to no avail. Neither was I successful to convince Lee to be sportier. Get your troubles, your sadness, and anger out of your systems through hard physical exercise. I advised them both. It worked so well in our case, unfortunately, neither of them would follow our advice. Next section, Lee and Admiral Chester Bruton, B-R-U-T-O-N, it looks like. There was a hiatus in our meeting with the Oswalds, as I had to fly to Haiti to sign a contract and then spend some time in New York preparing for the survey. Jean, during that time, did not see the Oswalds. She was finishing her design assignments and was packing. We would take a minimum of things to Haiti, leaving our furniture and heavy items in a warehouse in Dallas. Then I came back from New York and asked Jean to invite the Oswalds. They arrived immediately and brought baby June along. I remember this was a beautiful spring day, warm enough to swim, and so Jean called Franny, the wife of Admiral Chester Bruton, both good friends of ours, and incidentally, longtime enemies of Richard Nixon, whom they knew from his California days when he made his career-ruining good citizen's reputation. Admiral Bruton was a submarine hero of World War II, and I do not recall whether he had 4 or 5 naval crosses. He never talked about them, and a most humble and charming person. Fanny Bruton, an ex-schoolteacher, a painter, an admirable woman in many respects, had invited us that same day to a swimming party. Jean asked her if we could bring a couple of friends along. We mentioned the name of the Oswalds. Although we had spoken to her about this unusual couple, Franny was not sure who they were, but asked us to bring them along anyway. And so we arrived to Bruton's lovely place with a huge swimming pool, and Franny was delighted to see us. When I reminded her that Lee was an ex-Marine, she went to get the Admiral, who was a congenial man and liked to meet the enlisted men. In the meantime, Marina sat by the swimming pool with the baby. She either did not know how to swim or disliked showing her figure, which was not too hot. Jean gave her a conservative bathing suit, but she refused to use it. Lee sat quietly, immersed in his thoughts. That was frequent with him when he was in new surroundings. Before diving in, I told him jokingly, "Lee, isn't that funny that you get punished for your actions, which are only an appearance, but you don't get punished for your thoughts, which are the real thing?" While he was pondering over that, I continued, "This is a nice place. Makes you think of oppressed workers, etc. But you should see the places of the real moguls of finance. This is a poor admiral's retirement home." Franny and Jean were talking in the meantime with great animation about China. Franny, a world-traveled woman of most varied interests, knew China, where she spent several years with her husband. She loved the country and the people, and she and Jean hit it off fabulously well. I went back to Lee and told them quietly so that the ladies could not hear. Does the wife of the admiral strike you as an aristocratic rich woman? He just nodded agreement. Do you know that she is the daughter of a tenant framer widows from Oklahoma? In her childhood, the mother was so poor that she took washing in. Franny walked to school 4 or 5 miles. She couldn't afford to buy paper and used the margins of old newspapers to write on or to do her arithmetic. And the admiral was also a poor farm boy from Arkansas. He got his education in the Navy and is both a lawyer and an electronics engineer. I do not know why I wanted to talk so much, but this time I wish to convince Lee that all is not bad in this world and that the comforts obtained honestly are not to be despised. But Lee did not say anything. At that time came the Admiral Chester Bruton, not tall, broad of shoulders, a typical submariner. When I was in a submarine in the Pacific, he used to joke good-naturedly, I could turn around in the tower because I was constantly excited thinking of all those women in the mainland. So I had to forge ahead, and that's how I got my Navy crosses. We used to call him Henry in the French manner because he loved to speak French to us, and so did Franny. Both spoke French very well and were well read. Later they went to live in France. But this day he greeted everybody and began talking disgustedly of his new job with Collins Radio. Actually an important position he took after his early retirement from the Navy. All right, so alarm bells should be going off, and at this point we need to pull everything on Mr. Bruton and Collins Radio, who's a CIA company. Once again, George de Mohrenschildt, who claims not to be CIA, is surrounding himself with CIA people. Let me read that again. But this day he greeted everybody and began talking disgustedly of his new job with Collins Radio. Actually an important position he took after his early retirement with the Navy. He did not like the commercial aspects of his work. I should have stayed in the Navy a bit longer, he said irritably. I am not made to be a salesman. Something tells me this guy was naval intelligence. Then he began talking warmly with Lee, asking him about his duties in the Marine Corps, but my friend remained cool and aloof. Although Henry was kind and continued chatting amicably. That Marine Corps was the most miserable period in my life, he said disgustingly. Stupid work, ignorant companions, abusive officers. Boy, was I happy to have gotten out of it. To hell with the Navy. Here I saw for the first time his profound dislike for the military, and especially for the brass. The term admiral irritated him. He is somewhat of a rebel and a little bit of a Marxist, I told the admiral, trying to smooch over the disagreeable incident. I never saw Henry mad, but he was this time, and I knew that he could hardly restrain himself from telling Lee to stand at attention first and then order him out of the house. Instead, he just walked away. Lee did not continue being insulting and spoke politely with Franny about his stay in Japan. You lived in the compounds here, being officers' wives, and did not have the chance to meet the real people in Japan, like I did. I wish I could have, answered Franny diplomatically. Marina was the personification of charm that afternoon. We had to translate what she said, of course, but she loved the arrangement of the house as we took her around. The luxury really quite relative. Of the furnishings, Franny's painting, she was an excellent amateur painter in the whole thing, and the surroundings were an incredible contrast to the gloomy apartment of Elspeth Street, and so she smiled politely and even flirted with the Admiral. Excellent snacks were served later by our hosts, not a real dinner and nothing out of the ordinary happened anymore. Henry was a good host and restrained himself while Lee, finally relaxed, told some funny, if slightly derogatory, about his Marine Corps life. We had a sergeant in the Marines who was as racist as any German SS trooper, he began telling us. But then his sex habits. Please, Lee, I stopped him. I could sing you the Marine anthem, but fortunately I never learned it. Lee tried to be funny again. I cannot say that this evening was a great success, but we left quite late, still amicably, because most of the conversation at the end of the evening was carried on in French between four of us. 4 years later, we saw the Brutons again in Washington, D.C. They moved to Arlington permanently, and we spent a couple of days in their house. Naturally, the subject of the assassination came up, and the Brutons were absolutely flabbergasted. They did not associate the rude young ex-Marine with the presumable assassin of President Kennedy. They probably did not catch the Oswald's names when they had met them, and then they had traveled extensively in the meantime. Franny became quite excited that she had entertained that horrible individual. Henry, being an adventurous man, was rather amused than appalled by his fortuitous acquaintanceship. Well, he said jokingly, we met Nixon, and we also met Lee Harvey Oswald. Neither of the Brutons were ever approached by the FBI agents and had never been asked to testify at the Warren Committee. Nobody seems to have known of this strange meeting. It seems to me that I had mentioned it to Albert Jenner of the Warren Committee, but possibly he did not take me seriously, and then it may be that committee would not bother an American admiral. The so-called foreigners were to bear the brunt of the suspicious and innuendos. All right, so let's just talk about that for a minute. So now we have confirmation by George de Mohrenschildt that he introduced Oswald to somebody who worked at Collins Radio. Okay? Every single fucking person that Oswald ever met was working for the CIA. But Oswald wasn't? Give me a break. Easter of 1963. In April of 1963, we were at last ready to leave to New York first and then to Haiti. I could begin my work on my long-awaited contract, which was officially finalized, signed by the President Francois Duvalier, and published in the Haitian Congressional Record. All our light belongings were packed, furniture ready to be sent to the warehouse. During the commotion before departure, we saw little of Oswald's, and we knew that they were living practically like hermits. Nobody visited or invited them, except maybe the Paynes. On April 13th, if I remember correctly, we sat exhausted in the evening. This is a big holiday, and Jean and the Oswalds are alone. Even Marina is abandoned by the conservative refugees, as she had gone back to her Marxist husband. I agreed with Jean and commiserated with Marina. Being left alone was a penalty for her because she preferred Lee, notwithstanding all the fights and the beatings. Jean had previously bought a huge toy rabbit, practically June's size, a fluffy thing for the poor child. Oswald's new apartment was on Neely Street, a few blocks away from the old place on Elspeth Street. This was our first visit to their new abode, which was infinitely better than the previous one. So let's just make another correlation here, okay? So we have the Walker shooting, April 10th of 1963, okay? Shortly after that, Oswald heads back to New Orleans, and at the exact same time, here we go. We have April 13th, if I remember correctly. We sat in the evening exhausted. This was a big holiday, said Jean. Okay, so this is 3 days after the Walker shooting, and they're having a conversation with them, and they're saying that they're packing their stuff, and they're on their way to New York. And then immediately after that, Lee and Marina go back to New Orleans. Right? So de Mohrenschildt leaves, and then Oswald leaves. Why? What's the correlation? And if my guys can pull the actual date that Oswald left Dallas to go back to New Orleans in April of 1963, I'd appreciate that. There's something going on here, right? We can definitely sense that there's some reason for the powers that be to split these two up and send de Mohrenschildt to Haiti and send Lee back to New Orleans. Okay, hang on a second. All right, hang on. We've discussed this before, but I'm going to point this out again. So here we are, past April 13th. So we're coming up on the beginning of May, right? So the last 2 weeks of April is when Oswald had to have gone back to New Orleans. Who left New Orleans at the beginning of May of 1963? Not to return until September of 1963, September 4th, 3 weeks before Oswald heads back to Dallas. And then he allegedly puts in the application at the book depository. So I'm just trying to look at this timing here, because this timing, we know that it was William Seymour at the book depository, but we also know that Oswald had to go back to Dallas from New Orleans. See, when I hear about Oswald's relocating, the only things that come to mind are the same dates of, he goes back to New Orleans and Kerry Thornley leaves to go allegedly to Whittier, but we know that he didn't really go to Whittier. We know that he was really sticking around and impersonating Oswald and all those places, right? God, he's got like a 4-month alibi. It's ridiculous. All this stuff is connected here, okay? The timing of George de Mohrenschildt going to Haiti, Oswald going back to New Orleans, Kerry Thornley going to Whittier, California, and then the travels of, Hall Howard, and Seymour are all going on at this time also, right? And then Seymour gets the job at the depository on October 15th and 16th. Oswald puts in the application on the 15th, and I promise you that fucking Seymour started there on the 16th. That's what happened. All right, let's continue. I agreed with Jean and commiserated with Marina. Being left alone was a penalty for her because she preferred Lee, notwithstanding all the fights and beatings, which are bullshit. Jean had previously bought a huge toy rabbit, practically June's size, a fluffy thing for the poor child. Oswald's new apartment was on Neely Street, a few blocks away from the old place on Elspeth Street. This was our first visit to their new abode, which was infinitely better than the previous one. They had the second floor here, all to themselves. Huge trees shaded the structure, and in the backyard, the climbing roses hung up on the trestles. The house itself was a white frame of the usual type of southern structure. We rang the bell. The lights were off as it was obviously late for our sedentary friends. Although it was about 10 p.m., we had to keep ringing a long time. Finally, the front window opened. "Who's there?" asked Lee's familiar voice. "Jean and George, open up. We have something for June," I answered cheerfully. Lee came down, opened the front door, and led us up a dark staircase. Now Marina was up also, and the apartment was lit up. It was clean and spacious and almost void of furniture. "Isn't this a nice place?" confided Marina in Russian. "So much better than the old hole in the wall." We agreed and congratulated them on finding such a good place. She was cheerful, and Lee was smiling also, which hadn't often happened of late. He was happy that they were left alone by the emigres and even by the rare Americans they knew. Lee's feeling for the emigres could be compared to those of pro-Castro Cubans towards all the refugees crowding the streets of Miami. Hang on a second. What date is this? Let me see. When did they say they did this? So allegedly right after they moved into this place on Neely Street. Had to have been in April. I need to get a timeline of Oswald's residences together. I can't tell, but this is obviously in late April. Had to have been in late April. All right, let me continue. Lee appeared satisfied with his job and proud of being able to provide a better place for his family. This was the first time we did not see any conflict between him and his wife. Of course, what follows will prove that all was not honey in the Oswald family. Marina served soft drinks and began discussing some domestic affairs with Jean. Lee and I walked to the balcony and began to chat. He was very curious about my project in Haiti, but so far neither of us were sure it would materialize. Now it was a fait accompli. Lee envied my profession and a chance I would have to help an undeveloped country and the poor people there. Incidentally, he knew Haiti from his readings. He was aware of the oldest independent black republic in the world. He had learned that Haiti had helped the United States during the War of Independence, a fact not known to many Americans of his age and background. He also had heard about the United States intervention in Haiti after World War I. Actually, at the end of the war and of the long American occupation of that country. He even learned which part of the Espanola Island the Republic of Haiti occupied and her size. "You are very lucky going there. It will be an exciting experience," he said, and this opinion was valuable and encouraging to me. What does that say? To me, because most of my friends and acquaintances had a very dim view of my whole project and thought it would be dangerous and a waste of time. It turned out to be one of the most useful and pleasant experiences of our lives. But most of these advisors knew little about Haiti, and I mean well-educated, prominent people. To them, it was an insane, tropical black republic, rather a ferocious dictatorship. Some had predicted the worst disasters if we lived there. Then we talked pleasantly of his job, of June, who was growing nicely, and we also spoke of the unfortunate rise of ultra-conservatism in this country, of racist movements in the South. Lee considered this the most dangerous phenomenon for all peace-loving people. Economic discrimination is bad, but you can remedy it, he said, but racial discrimination cannot be remedied because you cannot change the color of your skin. Of course, he greatly admired Dr. Martin Luther King and agreed with his program. I just mentioned it here, but he frequently talked to Dr. King with a real reverence. In the meantime, Marina was showing Jean her bedroom, kitchen, and the living room. There she opened a large closet next to the balcony and began to show Jean her wardrobe, which was considerable. On the bottom of the closet was a rifle standing completely openly. Look, look, called Jean excitedly. There's a rifle there. We came in and I looked curiously. Indeed, there was a military rifle there of unknown type to me, something dangling in front. What is that thing dangling? Asked Jean. It's a telescopic sight, I answered. Jean never saw a telescopic sight before and probably did no understand what it is, but I did. I had graduated from a military school. Why did you have this rifle here? Jean asked Lee. Lee bought it, answered Marina instead. Devils know why. We something all the money we have for food and lodging, and he buys that damn rifle. But what does he do with a military rifle? Asked Jean again. He likes shooting at the leaves. But when does he have time to shoot at the leaves in the place? Asked Jean curiously. He shoots at the leaves in the park whenever we go there. This did not make much sense to us, but liking target shooting ourselves, we did not consider this a crazy occupation. All this time, Lee stood next to me, curiously silent. Total bullshit, right? Did you take a pot shot at General Walker, Lee? I popped a question spontaneously, and then a guffawed, ha-ha. Think this is a pretty good joke. Lee's reaction was strange. I often tried to reconstruct it. He did not say anything. He just stood there motionless. It was naturally a very foolish joke because there was an attempt a few days before at General Edwin Walker, a rather notorious character who was asked to resign his post in Germany by General Eisenhower, if I remember correctly. Anyway, he was an ultra-rightist who had tried to run for governor of Texas, and he got a surprising number of votes, some 200,000, on a political platform somewhat to the right of Hitler's. This joke just popped out because General Walker lived fairly close to us on Turtle Creek. Everyone knew his house with a huge American flag in front, sometimes replaced by a Confederate flag, and much later by South Vietnamese and Rhodesian flags. As I said, Lee's facial expression remained calm. He became just a little paler. This was the last time I saw him, and yet I cannot say with precision what his reaction was. I think he mumbled something unintelligibly, and I did not ask. For sure he was embarrassed, possibly stunned, and Marina was definitely shocked. Neither Jean nor I had laughed much at any Walker joke, and certainly not Marina nor Lee. Only later we realized how stunning and unexpected this joke was, to hit the nail on the head. Marina testified at Warren Committee that I knew that Lee shot at General Walker, and she also testified under oath that Lee did not shoot at General Walker and had missed him narrowly. I do not blame General Walker. We called him jokingly General Fokker, who I never had the pleasure of meeting for calling me a dangerous radical. I stupidly laughed at a bullet which might have killed him. The joke cost me a lot of money, and by hurting badly many of my business contacts. Marina testified also that Lee indeed considered General Walker a fascist and tried to kill as the most dangerous man for this country. Marina's testimonies turned out to be contradictory and vague, but there is another thing which makes me believe that Lee possibly tried to shoot General Walker. A man whose name I don't recall, a Jewish man who met Lee at the Ford Christmas party, described General Walker as the most dangerous man in the United States, potentially a neo-fascist leader. I noticed that Lee kept on asking why. The other fellow explained clearly his reasons. Lee might have been influenced by this statement. Another possible reason is the inscription on Lee's photograph, which we received posthumously, and Marina's inscription on it. I shall talk about it later. The innocuous remake of mine influenced, I can't read that word, R-E-M-A-K, what the fuck does that mean? Of mine influenced our lives, but we heard later from Albert Jenner, counsel of the Warren Committee, that Marina's testimony was even more damaging to me. She supposedly remembered me saying, Lee, why did you miss him? That I naturally did not say, and Marina was so vague in her recollection that even the Warren Committee did not take her seriously. Actually, I think Marina believed that I knew somehow of Lee's shooting at General Walker, and that's why she was so afraid that evening that I might tell the police or FBI about it. Lee, on the other hand, never considered me capable of treason, and then he knew, of course, that I was completely unaware of his attempt. Lee was a little scared of my extrasensory perception, which I still have with my students. Had I known anything about it, I would have persuaded him not to try any such crazy foolishness. Lee often commented with amazement that I could guess his thoughts, and I do believe in the existence of ESP, especially among people attuned to each other. It happened to me constantly that I guess who was on the line when the phone rings. I know when somebody close to me writes a letter or wants to get in touch with me. It even happened that I am thought suddenly of a well-known person, but barely known to me. Turn on the TV, and there he was. This happened, I remember, with Captain Rickenbacker, whom I knew slightly, but admired a great deal. We were sitting in a living room with friends in New Orleans, and I said suddenly, "Turn on the radio, Captain Rickenbacker is going to speak," and he did. Anyway, this evening of Easter of 1963 ended in an amicable manner. We walked in the small garden, and Marina gathered a gorgeous bouquet of yellow roses and gave it to Jean in appreciation of the rabbit and she had brought for the child. The Oswalds were also happy that I did not mention any more rifle or the Walker joke instead of making an issue out of it. It was our last meeting and a friendly one. We said that June looked less now like Khrushchev. She was growing up. She did not have such a bald head. Her eyes got bigger and she was less chunky. Lee himself mentioned it, caressing the child. "Look, she is much better looking now than our great Russian leader." "I hope she keeps his amusing and friendly personality," said Jean. "He's gone now, blessed his Bible-quoting soul and his earthly personality. His sudden bursts of anger and beating of the table with his shoe are all gone and belong to history. Millions of Russians miss him. After this Easter visit thing, we began to move so fast for us that we could not see the Oswalds, and we did not even talk to them on the phone." All right. So that brings us up to the next chapter, our move to Haiti. And so I'm going to hold this off for tomorrow. It is Sunday. I got day 0 later on. Tune in to day 0. I also appreciate it if you guys would buy the book. It'd be really appreciated. I think that's going to do it for me today. So, Bloody History World War II. We will be back tomorrow with 5 new episodes this week. If you haven't subscribed to that, please do. It is the only World War II show in the world right now that anyone's doing that you should listen to. Although if you really are a fan of World War II, I've been watching a lot of the Mark Felton stuff on YouTube. Really, really good stuff. Quality work there. And he avoids all Holocaust stuff, which is nice. But all right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be back tomorrow. I appreciate you tuning in.